Alright, so let's try this out. What I got here is some stuff that I've already written down from studying this matter previously. And I'm just gonna go over what I have thus far, and then I'll get into trying to get new knowledge on this topic. So, as you can see here, the topic being learning, and underneath I have the goal. I think I'm gonna have this as the setup. I mean, honestly, this is my first time doing it, so I can't see myself changing it, but I do want the topic to be the header, and underneath the topic, I want a goal. Why is it that I'm learning this? And what precedes might change, most likely to change, at least the format, but what follows after the goal would be the actual material. And as you can see, this is learning how to learn. My goal being to understand the most effective ways of learning and how to implement said knowledge for a desired outcome. Obviously, that all varies on what you're learning, what you want to take from that. You know, you can just learn something for pleasure, you can learn something for a skill. That all depends. Anyways, so one of the things that I have here is identify, input, reflect, implement, and share. Luckily for myself, because this was all written a couple weeks ago and barely getting into it right now, so I'm glad I gave myself a good description of what these mean. Identify. Understand what you are dealing with. So what is it that you are trying to pick up on? How are you going to pick up on something without acknowledging that thing first? That's what identify means. So then after identifying what it is that you want to understand, then you have input. Intake of information via senses. So how is it that you are going to learn about this material that you've identified in the last step? Are you going to view it? Are you going to listen to it? How is it that you're going to observe this and intake information? So after that, we have reflect. So after you've observed, you have to summarize the input you've retained thus far and how it could be utilized. So basically make use of the information, or rather not make use, because that's going to be in the following step, but understand how it can be used. Then, as I mentioned earlier, implement. Utilize input retained. So at this point, now you're acting on the knowledge that you've come across. And what follows after is sharing, and that's have the ability to break down the input retained and how it is utilized in a digestible manner for anyone of any level or familiarity to grasp. Also seek feedback. Feedback is good. Keep you humble. Then we have here the memory palace technique. Now this one was weird. It was definitely an unorthodox way of learning that I never thought of, but it seemed so right when I did find out about it. It's almost as though it's something that I've practiced previously. It seems very familiar, but novel at the same time. And I know that doesn't really make sense, but let's get into it. So, what this technique is I laid it out here, 5 steps. So, step 1, you have to visualize a location in your mind. Doesn't matter what location. Actually, I would say it's a location that you are familiar with, because as you'll see in the following steps, that does matter. Step 2, list distinctive features. Please excuse the music in the background. It's my brother. He's out there getting game. Anyways, so you have to list distinctive features. And so what this is essentially, from where I learned this, the example was, think about your house. Now, most of the time you want to think about your home because it's something that you're very familiar with. Now, picture it in your head. There's a door, and inside that door is the beginning of your home. What is it that you see? What are some distinct features of your home? For me, entering, you see a couch, you see a TV, you see a mirror, etc. You have to be familiar with this. You have to be able to visualize it in your mind. Then imprint said knowledge or said location with said distinctive features in your mind. So that's the third step that I was just describing. Next, you're going to want to associate that whatever knowledge it is that you're trying to retain with said distinctive features. Now, let me see this real quick. Yeah, so you associate knowledge with said distinct features, and then the 5th step is when you actually practice everything all together. You visit said location and practice retrieving knowledge from the distinctive features you associated it with. Now, let me give you an example of what that looks like. I'm visualizing my house, and I'm going into my house now, opening the door, but we can already start with the doorknob. Doorknob is a distinct feature, so I see the doorknob there, and say the doorknob reminds me of the number 2. So now whenever I visualize my house and I visualize going into my house, the first action I have to do to get into my house is turn the doorknob. And then, so I visualize myself going for the doorknob. What is it that the doorknob reminds me of? The number 2. I open the door and I see the mirror that I told you about. The mirror reminds me of the number 11. So whenever I open the door, I think of the number 2. Whenever I see the mirror, I think of the number 11. And so you can see this is a weird technique, but I can see it working because you're subscribing information to something just random, and because it's so random, it kind of makes you remember that association. Like, who would have thought a doorknob would remind you of the number 2, or a mirror would remind you of the number 11? That's essentially how this works. And of course, that was just an example of it. You can train yourself to be completely more complicated in that. You can remember facts. You can associate facts instead of numbers. I was just trying to simplify it so you would understand what it is that it's trying to get at. And following that, we have the Feynman technique, very popular technique. And I laid it out in 4 steps. First step being, explain what you understand thus far. So, you're learning about a topic. Try explaining that topic. See what you know of that topic. So say you're out at a bar with a friend. Try to explain the thing it is that you're learning to that friend. And what that'll do is it'll basically show you how knowledgeable you are on that matter. And as you'll see in number 2, it's getting to the same idea in terms of having you retrieve information on that topic to see where you stand. But this time you explain it with all its nuances, and you seek feedback at the end. So here it is. Teach it to anyone regardless of how familiar they are to that subject. So as you'll see in step 4, typically you want to teach it to someone and have them sort of get a grasp of that from the get-go without having any prior knowledge on it. A little bit redundant there, but we'll continue. Step 3, fill in the gaps. Focus on the gaps you're weak in and/or previously oblivious to. So as you try to explain it and then you teach it, you'll start to understand, wait a minute, this goes a little bit more in depth, or I'm not taking this to account, or I completely forgot about so-and-so. That's good. Because if you're becoming aware of these things, these knowledge gaps, then you can address them. And so addressing them will ultimately help you fill those gaps in, and thus give you better understanding of what it is that you're trying to learn. And once you do that, you can move on to step 4, which is simplify and have the ability to teach it to a child regardless of the topic's complexity. So say you're teaching or you're learning about rocket science. If you have a very deep understanding of rocket science, you should be able to simplify it and teach it to a child, even though it's rocket science and you wouldn't generally think a child can comprehend rocket science. And I'm not saying the child's gonna walk out a rocket scientist, but you can give them general ideas that they can actually grasp, regardless of how complex the topic is that you're teaching them. Dumb it down. That's a good way. That's a good way. Alright, so excuse me. I have some other stuff that I have here that I got. I believe these upcoming things are from, with the exception of the Zeigarnik effect. I think I pronounced that right. The rest of this is from Andrew Huberman's podcast on learning. And so we'll just dive into this here. I wrote, participate in the practice of the material you're trying to learn without aid, solely with what you know at that very moment. It is a raw indication of your ability to retrieve and implement knowledge. Errors trigger neuroplasticity. Frustration is the feeling to follow. And train yourself to constantly push boundaries by sticking with a matter until you do. So, this is basically, the first sentence at least, is quizzing yourself. Or putting yourself out there in an environment where you display your understanding. One or the other. So say you're learning about history, have a little quiz. Ask yourself some questions. Generate some questions about the topic that you're learning. And, you know, I would say probably ask yourself those questions at a time that you're not learning the subject. So not during studying hours, but rather outside of studying hours, so that you can see whether or not you've actually retained the knowledge. And as you can see in the second sentence here, it's a raw indication of your ability to retrieve and implement the knowledge. So the retrieval is, you know, if you're learning facts about history, implementation of the knowledge, like let's say you are coding and you just bring up your computer and you get to it and you want to write some code. That's the implementation. You'll see whether or not you can actually write code after studying the language. And then we get into some very interesting things here, which is errors trigger neuroplasticity. Now, in one of the Andrew Huberman podcasts, he talked about neuroplasticity, and essentially that's the ability for your brain, or at least this is what I got from it. I'm probably going to be wrong in this, but I have a pretty good idea of what it means, neuroplasticity. And you know what? Why not just search it up right now? Because I don't think. Well, before I search it up, let me try to retrieve. Let me give you a first-hand example of these protocols. Neuroplasticity. Neuro, let's say meaning of brain, plasticity. I can't really say what plasticity means. I know it's something that's uh, I want to say uh, malleable, but so let's say the brain being malleable. Um, so neuroplasticity is the abilities to I don't know if it's to create neurons or to create new neuron pathways, which would then in turn reinforce particular ideas or information that you've had before. Let's see. Probably going to be completely wrong, but somewhere in the general scope. Let's see. The ability of the brain to form and recognize synaptic connection, especially in response to learning or experience or following injury. All right, so that's there you have it. That's neuroplasticity. And I mean, not too far off, but errors. You would have thought, at least for me, I thought errors is something that you don't want. Errors are bad. No one likes errors. At least that's what I was taught. This might be different with you. You know, from my upbringing, say you take a quiz, you score 5 out of 10 on that quiz. Your teacher comes up to you with a disappointed look, hands you the paper, says, you need to do better. You need to review these things. Not good. It's not looking good. You can do better. And, in this example, perhaps it's my fault for taking the teacher's message and morphing it into something that it probably wasn't meant to be, which is the teacher does say you can do better, but what I take away from it is the disappointing look in their face, the disappointment in their voice. And so that kind of overwhelms what is being articulated. And maybe this is just me, but then I sort of associate errors with this is not good. And it's not good in many cases, You don't want to be doing errors as a surgeon. However, errors are good, or rather, great, because if you can identify the error, then you've identified a shortcoming. Once you've and going back to probably our first one right here, you've identified what it is that you've made a mistake with. And then you can learn all about that mistake. Why is it that you made that mistake? And you can see by learning why you made that mistake, you dive into the nuances of that topic, of that error, and you have the ability to essentially grow from it. And that's how errors should be looked at. In that podcast, he, being Andrew Huberman, tried to convey that idea that you should look at errors as something not so negative, but rather opportunistic. I think so, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But frustration is a feeling to follow. So typically, when you're trying to learn something and something's not coming to you, a lot of people quit. Now, tell me this. Let's say there's two alternate realities. In alternate reality A, you have me learning a topic about learning. On alternate reality B, we have the very same thing, duplicate. Now, let's say alternate reality me is becoming frustrated with what it is that I'm learning, and it's just not making sense, and I just, it's at that moment it's beyond me, and I just don't want to follow through, and I just quit. I just, right here, boom, X, boom, and I open up League of Legends, which I deleted because it's so toxic, and I get into that, and I just forget all about this little study session that I had. Forget about it. Then you have alternate reality B, where I feel the same way. I'm frustrated, but now I understand that this frustration is something to follow, because you can train yourself to constantly push boundaries by sticking with a matter until you do so. So, say alternate reality B, me, understands that I'm frustrated, but if I stick to it, I can get somewhere better in that pursuit than the alternate reality A version of me who just quit. So you have someone who quit and just forgot all about it, and you have someone who stood their ground, didn't let a little bit of frustration destroy their willpower to chase this knowledge. Well, obviously, alternate reality B is going to put themselves in a better position to understand this topic. So, understanding that frustration is a feeling to follow. Once you get frustrated in what you're learning, feel that frustration, understand that frustration. But don't let that frustration consume you, overwhelm you, and ultimately discourage you from what it is that you're trying to do. That's powerful. Andrew Huberman's onto some really great things. I love that guy. That guy's amazing. I love the content that he puts out. And he also talked about, so this is one thing that really got to me, because I've been slacking off ever since high school, even through high school. I mean, all of my educational career, I've really been a slacker from elementary to, I'd say, about middle school. Schooling was rather simple for me. I didn't have to study at all. Things just came to me naturally. It was pretty easy, if I do say so. Up until high school, that's when things got a little bit more difficult. I got into matters at a level that had me actually finding myself studying. But because I never really studied previously, I didn't have a good idea of how to study, so I experimented with my studying as most kids do. But I felt like I was a little bit late to the game in that sense, and that was only exacerbated when I went on to college. And even now, I really don't know how to study, and perhaps that's partially why I am doing this, because studying is ultimately learning, or at least having the goal of learning. And so I'm doing this for that very reason. I want to, let's go back to the goal. Let's understand the most effective ways of learning and how to implement said knowledge for a desired outcome. So I do see myself studying for the rest of my life as much as I can. But why should I go ahead and do that without really knowing how to do it? I mean, I can wing it, but how potent is that winging going to be? Why not take the time to learn how to learn and then proceed with whatever follows? That's what I'm doing here. And so what I'm getting at is, by the age, roughly around the age of 25, neuroplasticity in the human isn't so malleable. And so one of the things he saw from studies is incremental learning is more effective for adults to increase neuroplasticity. So it's not completely a loss for anyone above the age of 25. You don't become stupid immediately after the age of 25. It's just that it becomes a little bit more difficult to learn as efficiently and effectively as someone prior to them. I mean, look at kids, in a matter of years, they learn a new language and they learn all these new motor skills, and they started learning new concepts, and they're very creative, they're hyper creative. You learn adults, they become pretty complacent, and they kind of tunnel their vision into one particular area and become highly proficient in said area. And that might just be for this reason that neuroplasticity becomes pretty diminished. But as you'll see right here, effective learning increases. Incremental learning is a key to that. Short, focused learning sessions with few errors, not too easy or not too difficult of a session. Work on those few errors. So when you're doing this, obviously it's short. You're not going to be going for hours on end with a book to your face, drooling about what it is that you're learning. No. It's going to be a lot shorter, but because it's a lot shorter, you can really focus into what it is that you're learning. Like, dedicate that time for that. No distractions, none of that. It's solely you and that topic. I want to say you want to put yourself in a state of flow, but honestly, I don't know too much about the state of flow, and I wouldn't really rely on it. But you get the idea. And it's not too easy, not too difficult. So, I recall I'm trying to recall the example he gave, Andrew Huberman. which is okay. So say you're you're trying to code something, and or let's do another one where say you want to practice math. You know, you don't want to practice math with a simple addition. 2 plus 2 equals 4. Although you know, people like George Orwell will tell you it might be a 5, or at least people in the book he's written of will say it's 5. Um, anyways, uh, you don't want to do something that simple. And then again, you don't want to be going into something that's out of your grasp. Say you're at a calculus level, you don't want to be going into, you know, something like linear algebra without having done linear algebra. It might just be too difficult for you to get anywhere with it. And then once you get those few errors, you work on them. And with that, I will be right back. Had to go take a whiz. I don't care about this being so professional. You know, it's my first one. We'll see how it goes. Better than nothing. Better than alternate reality A. Just quits. But yeah. In that short focused learning, try pushing yourself to the point of having a few errors. So 2 plus 2, too easy. Linear algebra, too hard. Put yourself in the middle, keep pushing until you hit a few errors. Once you hit those errors, work on them. Work on them. That's going to get you places that you've never been before. So now we get on to the Zeigarnik effect, the Zeigarnik effect. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. Anyway, you have unfinished or slash or interrupted tasks are remembered. Unfinished and slash. Let me just start off. That was terrible. Unfinished and slash or interrupted tasks are remembered more in depth when retrieved at a later time. Space intake of knowledge, cramming is overwhelming and thus ineffective. So this one, I don't know how effective this is. I mean, I feel like it's one of those things where it just varies from person to person. So this one is essentially unfinished. So you're working on something and that something doesn't get, that task doesn't get finished, or it's interrupted, and later on you start to think about it. And I think I wrote it down how I learned it, which is it's something that's remembered more in depth when it retrieved at a later time. But I really feel like it's something that's really, instead of remembered but stressed over. I think that's what it's trying to get to, where you stress over something because it's unfinished or interrupted, and it wasn't supposed to be, and you'll stress over it, and because you stress. And I'm not actually, now thinking about it, I'm not saying that that's bad, because many procrastinators such as myself would have an assignment due, let's say, um 10 days, in 10 days, and they wait until the ninth day, where the stress is so overwhelming and you just can't think about anything else except that task that you haven't gotten done, but you had a good amount of time to get done. And then you eventually put yourself down and you just put it all into work, and you get that work done. And that's kind of what it is right here. This might just be the the procrastinator effect, really. Well, it's basically, you're working on something, or it's something that you haven't worked on, but something important to you, and so you keep thinking about it outside of the time that you're actually working on it, and that'll motivate you to actually participate in continuing that pursuit. But I believe I do recall that having space of the intake of knowledge is generally a good idea, because it gives your mind some pause in that. And when you come back to it, refreshed. And coming back to a topic refreshed could potentially lead to new perspectives, a creative way of interpreting yeah interpreting what it is that you're learning. Cramming is not good. Usually cramming, I would say, is effective and efficient if you are going to utilize that knowledge once, immediately after the cramming. So say you have a huge test, cramming may be effective for you. Maybe. I don't know. It varies. But I know I've crammed a lot, and it was effective for me and efficient. But generally, if you want to actually have a good understanding of that topic, it's not the way to go, because I could cram for a biology test, but ask me some of those questions 2, 3, 4 months later, and I won't be able to give you the answer. Or I'll give you an answer, just not the correct one. So this is a pretty neat fact right here. With came out of a study again that Andrew Huberman talked about, which is the value of importance learning something affects the rate and magnitude of neuroplasticity. The starving man will find a way to feast. So, if you're really adamant about learning something, and it's very, very important that you do learn that something, that actually affects the rate and magnitude of neuroplasticity, so the malleability of you obtaining that, or and obtaining and retaining that knowledge. So this is a good example. You have a kid, you're in high school. That kid, all he wants to do is play sports. He wants to be the best soccer player of all time. He can give, maybe I shouldn't say it, but he doesn't give, he doesn't give an F about history, or maybe let's say math. Let's say math, because that's, history's might be a little bit entertaining. Um, let's say math. Like, what are you gonna use math for out in the soccer field? He doesn't give an F about math. So there's not a lot of value or importance of learning math for this person who aspires to be the best soccer player. What do you think is going to happen? I mean, if the man is genius, he might retain the information, but generally what will happen is, if you're not interested in the topic and it's not of importance to you, then you're not going to retain that knowledge. And you know, that makes sense, because think about it. We are constantly being bombarded with all sorts of information. We would not be able to retain all of that information, especially like the trivial information. Like, that's something that goes in of your brain and out of the brain. You process it and it just goes out, because it's not something that is very important to us, and you're not going to remember it. You know, I scrolled through my Instagram feed. I saw some stuff. I don't even know what I went through. Pretty bad. And but that's a good thing. That's a good thing that I don't remember, because why the fuck, all right, why the fuck would I want to remember what was on my Instagram feed? I, beats me. Like, it's just, it's trivial stuff to me. It's not something of value to me. It's not something of importance to me. And so, because that is, I'm not going to retain that information. And that's what that's getting at. You're really curious about a topic and you really want to learn something. Say you're in a position where there's a new position for your job that needs to be filled, pays better, but it does require you to take on more responsibilities which you may not have the skills to fully engage in. Perhaps you might want to begin learning how to take on those responsibilities so that you can obtain that job. And because you're so set on that, you're more likely to learn that and then meet your goal of obtaining that position. And lastly, we have here the failure loophole. So again, credit to the great Andrew Huberman. Here I have it laid out. Errors to frustration to realizing importance of errors plus frustration equals dopamine hit and continuation. So I talked about this a little bit earlier, but this is what I call the failure loop. Actually, I don't even know if I call it the failure loop. I don't think Andrew Huberman called it that, or a loophole rather, but I call it the failure loophole because, okay, so as we talked about, errors are good things, they're great things, because it's an indication of something going sideways, but where something goes sideways, you can straighten. And so You have errors, and typically people, when they get errors, and even with knowing that errors are grades, you still could feel frustrated with what it is that you're learning. But now you start putting all of these things together, all of the things that you learned about here. You have errors, which will lead to frustration. But then you have this important thing, which is realize this is key right here. Realizing importance of errors plus frustration will lead to what? Boom. Dopamine hit. And once you get that dopamine hit, boom. Alternate reality B right there. You continue. This is what I was getting at. And that's, I mean, that's powerful right there. Like, imagine that. Like, it's you're this is like a perfect way of utilizing knowledge. This is the knowledge right here, and this is the effects that come from it, and it's very powerful. Something that I now take into account whenever I'm trying to learn something. Something I'm sure I'll continue to take account of, such as today. Like, today was a very huge mess of a show or episode or video, what have you. But I honestly don't care. I wanted to show up. I wanted to do this. And as you can see right here, this is what I'm going to be getting into later. It's ultra learning. I'm currently listening to the audiobook on ultra learning by, hold on one second. I know his name is Scott, but let me give him credit here. Scott H. Young. And so I'm going to be taking some takeaways from that book, and hopefully I'll be writing down some protocols and some very helpful information here that can help with anyone trying to become an ultra learner. But until then, keep at it, as will I. I think that concludes today's video. And I'll see you guys next time. Take care.